I was just going to boil it down to social anxiety. How do I fit in? And also meta understanding of being worried about how I fit in.
They don't want therapy. They want TikTok. They don't want advice. They want to be seen.
There are so many more choices. That's part of what's so difficult about being a teenager is you need to figure out who you're going to be and how you're going to be and how you're going to make a living.
This episode dives into the minds of Gen Z, navigating gender identity, digital dopamine, and the crippling fear of being misunderstood.
You better have it done before 18 because now it's get in there and compete and win. Just somebody to listen to me and try to figure me out so that I can figure me out.
Parents are left walking on eggshells wondering, am I failing?
Before it used to be, how am I in comparison to my neighborhood? And now it's, how am I comparatively to the world?
Therapists step into the chaos to decode this generational identity crisis.
Men who are coming to therapy and asking the question of, I'm curious why I'm having a hard time with this. That's really the question to interact with. That openness to saying, yeah, I want to know, I want to learn, I want to be curious about this. It gives me hope.
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin. Hello, welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. You're joining us for another roundtable. It's our second one. So this month we've been focusing on Gen Z men and young men and their parents. So it's one of the major questions that we get. I tend to work with guys that, are new fathers and they're worried. They're worried about the generation. They feel like there's a major gap between the current generations. And I'm hoping that our two experts, Jack Lambert and Tim Mullins, can highlight and kind of teach you all about what's going on with the younger generation of men. So I'm excited to welcome you both to the show. So Jack, do you want to start with introducing yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Jack Lambert. I'm a licensed mental health counselor here in New York City. I've worked with a lot of Gen Z men, a lot of parents of Gen Z men, kind of more in the college level currently, but very happy to be here.
Awesome. And Tim, how about yourself?
Hi, yeah, I'm Tim Mullins. I work at Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm an LPC, licensed professional counselor in Colorado. I have worked with a lot of adults actually integrating into their relationship with their children. And especially lately, I've been getting a lot of teenagers coming in with their parents to try and work on communication and improve their relationship. And it's been really, really gratifying.
Fantastic. Yeah, so Tim is one of the counselors here at MTO. So he is available and accepting new clients. Jack, you're also accepting new clients, right?
Correct.
Yeah, so all the links for them will be in the show notes if you want to reach out to them and learn more about what they do. So let's start with our first question. Kind of starting very basic here. So what are you seeing as some of the most common struggles for Gen Z and teenage boys right now? And are they different from what you think men were going through 10 or 15 years ago?
I think the idea of socialization and getting out there and socializing with people, our world is changing so rapidly that face-to-face interaction is becoming less and less of a norm. And I think that teenagers are learning how to navigate different ways of communicating. And part of that, again, having worked with parents and their children, is their parents are coming from a very different generation, a different way of interacting. And sometimes it's kind of hard for the parents to even understand what their children are experiencing. I have a nephew who actually, his best friend was someone he gamed with online for 10 years, and he never met him face to face. And the concept of, this is my best friend, but I've never met him, I don't even know how to frame that. I mean, it completely blew my mind. So being able to communicate with your parents or with your teen is getting more and more difficult as the rate of progress and the rate of change increases and accelerates. And I think that that's one of the most important anchors that a teen needs, is to be able to communicate with their caregivers, their parents, and learn from them. So that's becoming more strained in my view.
I was going to say I absolutely agree with the communication aspect. I think that that's one of the biggest things I'm seeing, even a 5 year ago difference. You know, when we talk about COVID and quarantine and things like that, we really had a decrease in personal communication, even in the classroom. Everything was done online. So I saw a lot of kids coming in who were really just trying to figure out how to socialize and, you know, basic social skills even, let alone trying to communicate to their parents what it's like to be away from home or to communicate to them, this is something that I would need. I ran into a lot of students coming in that were saying, I don't even think my parents are going to be open to me going to therapy. They're not going to pay for it, or they don't even want to see it on the insurance bill. I'm scared, and, you know, of them seeing that. So I would say communicating between caregiver and parent and between peers, they're almost two different languages, but, you know, it is that communication arc throughout that I'm just seeing a big difference in.
Yeah, that's really well said. You know, I'm curious, like from their perspective, what's bringing them to therapy? You know, because I think with a lot of teenagers, it's the parents that have them come. You know, maybe they're concerned about their behavior or drug and alcohol use or, you know, being isolated or withdrawn. But what are the actual teenagers talking about in the rooms, in the therapy room?
Relationships with everything and everyone. And I say thing because it's media, it's TikTok, it's Instagram, you know, like, you know, we could really go on a list of things that kind of they bring up here, but it falls within that communication standard of just not being able to feel as competent. They might not use that language, but I think that's the underlying core aspect of it, of not feeling as competent or able to communicate and express themselves in a way that feels gratifying for them, or that they get back what they want or what they need.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was just going to boil it down to social anxiety. It's how do I fit in, and also that kind of meta understanding of being worried about how I fit in.
Yeah, so I'm curious from your experience, like, is this normal teenage awkwardness, or do you feel like it's been amplified by technology or by the changing culture?
Yeah, that's really hard to say, because I think I see both. I definitely see a lot of this is just, you know, your absolute, this is the developmental challenge of their stage, is how do I learn to communicate to people? How do I be okay with feeling like I am communicating myself? And at the same time, it's really hard not to look back at COVID and go, oh man, look what that did to us. But I think it just kind of was a step. It was just kind of a blip, like a fold in time that shot us forward a few years, which was disconcerting for everybody. But this is where we were heading. I mean, technology is changing so much, and we're adapting rapidly. And that's part of what's so hard about being a teenager, is that everything's different, and everything's getting different a lot faster now.
And I think the technology aspect amplifies, maybe, you know, to answer your question in a way of like, yes, it's the normal, you know, Eric Erickson, I think around this age, is identity versus role confusion. And if anything, social media is amplifying that, because before it used to be, how am I in comparison to my neighborhood, you know, the kids that I go to school with? And now it's, how am I comparatively to the world, or to, you know, this same boy who's my age who lives, you know, in a completely different culture, or has a completely different financial background than I do, or gender identity, or sexual, you know, the list can go on and on and on and on. And then, you know, it becomes lost in the sea of I'm floating alone and isolated, even though I'm surrounded by people and, you know, stimuli in that way. It's scary. You know, I think that again, maybe isn't a word that they would initially use, but it can be very scary to feel like I'm trying to solidify who I am, and I'm constantly being pulled in a million other directions.
Yeah. Yeah, and that dovetails kind of into my next question of, you know, I think there's so much discussion around gender, around masculinity. You know, if you look at one extreme with Andrew Tate and the Manosphere, you look at another, you know, side of the spectrum of, you know, gender nonconformity and trans, right? I think there's like a lot of really powerful voices around what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a young person in the world today. So I'm curious, you know, I guess question one is like, aren't the kids listening to this stuff, or is it just adults freaking out? You know, like, how serious is this polarity? And then question two, like, how are they relating to it, if they are at all? You know, how are they trying to orient about what it means to be, you know, a man in 2025?
I hear a lot of people, you know, I'll just say this, at least, you know, within my private practice, I see a lot of queer, gay, non-conforming, trans folks. I don't have a ton of straight men. The straight men that I do have in my practice or have interacted with, in a clinical sense, are very trepidatious about not wanting to come off as, a hyper masculine, for lack of a better term, an asshole. They don't want to come off in this way, and they feel nervous about, how do I avoid doing that? Because I have, all of these role models that are saying one thing, and then I'm being pulled in another direction to kind of say I need to be politically correct and aware and, find a feminist aspect of me, and, not even knowing what a lot of these words even mean. I think they're seeing these things, listening to these things on the outskirts of it. I don't ever hear any of these people saying, I'm sitting down and listening to, a full rant about male pride, but it's slipping into, again, maybe short videos, contextual things, YouTube, things like that. And they're picking up on, this is an option for me. And to be perfectly honest, if you're kind of faced with this, we see this a lot, not to keep bringing up like PC culture, but I think that sometimes people feel it's easier just to go full throttle towards, this is who I'm going to be unapologetically and just run with that. And, F you if you can't be along with that. And, I see these boys kind of on the precipice of, I can either choose to really lean into that and just say, whatever, or I can really try and be insightful and sit with the discomfort and sit with, the awkwardness of what this means, like to have this conversation with a therapist, and that's why I think podcasts like this are so important, because it allows people to kind of get this information without going to therapy, maybe necessarily in the first part, and saying, I don't really know about this. I have to admit that I'm lacking some knowledge about these things.
Yeah, I think I resonated with that idea of, I think there's almost kind of, I think backlash is a strong word, but there's a sensitivity of, being a 52-year-old white male it's almost a feeling like I have to tiptoe a little bit. I have to be on eggshells. I have to be very careful. And like you said, with some things that I don't even understand, that were never a part of my upbringing. So trying to be sensitive. I'm trying to think of from my client's perspective and not from my perspective. But I just see it as the pool is growing. There are just so many more things to consider. There are so many more choices. And I think that's part of what's so difficult about being a teenager is there's this infinite amount of choices that is kind of presented as, you need to figure this out now. You need to figure out who you're going to be and how you're going to be and how you're going to make a living. Although you never paid a bill, you don't even know what that means, but we have to sort this all out. And I see that pool growing. And like I said, from my demographic perspective, it's very sensitive. Yeah, you have to be very cautious about what you're saying. It feels that way.
And along with that kind of comes this openness, right? For us, but I could say this could be said for parents or teens or anyone, to this openness to being wrong and to not having all the answers, and to, being open to feedback, even if the feedback doesn't feel like it's being given in the best way. Like, it is not the job for other people to teach us how to act or how to interact with the world. But I think a lot of that is helped on the switch side, which is, men who are coming to therapy and asking the question of, I'm curious, I want to practice relating, or I'm having difficulty relating to certain concepts. Like, I want to know kind of where my pitfalls are, or why I'm having a hard time with this. That's really the question to interact with. Because if it just feels like I'm walking out into the world and I do have to tiptoe and someone's going to get me at some point, I'm going to say something wrong. Yeah, we're all going to say something wrong. It's just going to happen. And that's the idea of like, well, it's not the worst thing in the world. You're not being malicious about it, but you can sit with it and say, okay, I learned something. And in micro ways, that's what therapy is doing, right? It's softening our ability to say like, oh, that isn't the worst thing in the world, to learn these small little things. For lack of a better term, and not to be hating on social media or any of these things, because I do think that they're great resources for therapy and insight. I have a lot of clients that come to me and say, I saw this on Instagram the other day and it really resonated with me. So I love that. But there's not a lot of learning and dialogue happening. It's this is true, this is true, this is true, take that and run with it. And that can be scary if you feel like, well, why is this true? Why? I don't have any context for this.
Yeah, and I think that enters right there. There's the social anxiety of being a teenager. It's like that's even permeating out into the world. It's like, am I doing this right? How do I do this? And yeah, I love what you said about being willing to learn, being open to, okay, how do I learn about this instead of coming in and saying, here's what I think, here's how I think it should be.
Right. And to be doing all of this, I think, Tim, you also mentioned and then paying for your life and learning how to kind of function in these just real world aspects that aren't even necessarily socially influenced as much as they are how am I going to make a living? How do I handle finances? I have a client that I've met with for many years that has a lot, or have talked a lot about intersection of religion and sexuality. And we've talked for years about this. And today he goes, I really want to talk about my finances. I feel like my spending is out of control and I never learned how to stop that dopamine rush of, spend, or come off a certain way or appear. And it's just interesting how, that's not on the top of my list of things that I expect someone to come to talk to me about, but it's all related, of course, right? There was an insecurity related there and all of these things. So it's a lot of pressure always to be, a teen and growing up, but this just the increased access to pressures, that's really what we're seeing. And yeah, the social anxiety aspect, Tim, I think is a perfect mechanism of just, let me just push it away and avoid it because it's scary.
Yeah, can you guys both speak more to that urgency? Because I see that, with my young clients too. And I think there's kind of that colloquial phrase of, the kids are growing up faster now than they ever have. And I feel like that's the case. Certainly for me, growing up with access to the internet, growing up with access to, influencers, to people that seemed like they were already light years ahead of me in terms of finances or body image or, wealth. It's just this constant comparison. But I'm curious, about that urgency that these kids feel. Can you speak more to that?
It's in my opinion, I guess, and from what I've seen, it does seem to be a reaction to, I see other people getting it this quickly or faster, and I'm behind. And I do oftentimes think that is false. That other people aren't getting this faster or aren't doing these things, or if they are, it is such a small percentage, but it's blowing up on what they're seeing. So it feels like everyone has reached, maturity with sex, with relationships, with money, with finances, with education, whatever it is that you're interested in. It's so easy now to find someone or find several hundred people who are farther along than you are. And that just feeds this fire of, well, now I have to be, the best, or I have to figure out what my, next level up is going to be. And sometimes that's fueled by parents, right? Sometimes that narrative can be fueled without the parent maybe even realizing this isn't just about, I want you to do well and I want you to succeed. They're hearing this with, I'm behind. And if I, don't achieve these certain things, then something bad is going to happen.
I think, yeah, the culture has become so skewed toward the hyper successful, and that's the goal, is to be that influencer on YouTube, to be that person on Instagram that everybody knows. And those are the people that we see. So everybody just kind of assumes that that's who the world is. And we're so much more prone to compare ourselves to people who have already made it and been there, because the people that don't are just not in our purview. So we don't see them at all. And I think there's a perception that that's a much larger percentage of the world than it is, because it's who's right there in our faces all the time. And yeah, when I went to college a long time ago, college was a time to explore and figure out, what do you like? What do you want? What are some things you're thinking of doing? And what I see now is kids are going into college like, here's my path. Here's what I'm going to do. Here's how I have to get there. And then I see high school seniors are getting pressure that, yeah, you've got to have it all figured out because college is so competitive and you have to know your path. And yeah, that's just so lamentable to me, because that was the idea, is when do you get a chance to do that, to try out and experiment and figure out who you are? It comes down to that identity piece again. like, hey, you better have it done before 18 because now it's get in there and compete and win.
And along with the gender identity aspect, I have this interesting pattern that I've seen of kids really wanting to say, like, this is my gender identity. You know, not as much with sexuality. I will say more with gender identity. Like, this is it. I'm really leaning into it, and not being open to the idea of when you're 17, 18, you can absolutely know that, but it can be shifting. You know, there can be people, you know, we see a lot of people and celebrities now, you know, luckily, who are changing their gender identity later in life, or going by they, them pronouns, and saying, this is kind of what I would have liked to do always. Like, rather than kind of throwing yourself into these things just because it's like, oh, I feel some ambivalence around my gender, you know, you can say, right now, this is how I identify with, and that could change tomorrow, and I will let you know. But to almost have this piece with that happening. Obviously, this is, you know, I have had some clients come in that their identity is changing day to day, you know, and part of that we do want to discuss and talk about, like, well, in what ways does this feel, you know, productive? In what ways does this feel unstable? You know, and kind of sussing that out. But even just that ability can help calm this idea of, you've got to figure it out. You've got to know, you know, because you just don't. There's plenty of time to figure that out. But when we're putting all this pressure on grades and, you know, in athletics or arts or whatever it is, like, there is all this pressure felt. So it feels like, well, why shouldn't everything not be like it? Why everything should have that pressure?
If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show.
Yeah, I mean, let me ask about that specifically, because I think from the parents I work with, that's the number one question. It's like they just don't understand the gender fluidity piece at all, you know? And a lot of I work with only men, really. So the dads, right, will say, like, you know, I never questioned being a man. You know, I just knew I was a man. So I don't understand why my, you know, teenage son is worried about that. I don't know how to have those conversations with him, or I don't know. You know, I think on the, you know, most favorable side, it's confusion. I think on the, you know, least favorable side, it's like invalidation and judgment. But how do you, like, as a parent, how do you engage with this? Because this is, I think, like, the thing of this generation. You know, I think it's how Gen Z is really distinguishing, or has distinguished itself so far from generations that have come before it, is that they are way more vocal around nonconformity, being non-binary, and really embracing the, you know, the gender spectrum.
I had a lot of conversations like this when I was doing group therapy cross ages, and I would have some younger folks that would come in and you know, have a gender that isn't, you know, maybe what they're presenting. And, you know, and I'm painting with a broad brush here, but older clients who were truly invalidating and not even meaning to, who were saying, I just don't get it. There's nowhere for me to hang that concept on. If you look like this, I'm going to say this, you know, and really kind of trying to find ways therapeutically to hold that without saying, it just is what it is, you're going to have to accept it, you know, because that isn't helpful to hear sometimes, because they're like, but why? You know, there is some curiosity there. And I think curiosity might be the key word there, is for parents to be curious. And rather than saying that this curiosity is going to solve this conflict I have, is just saying, I want to be curious because I want to understand my child. You know, I do have to wonder sometimes if that invalidation is coming from their own concerns as a parent of what, you know, issues will my child face if they choose to identify this way, or if they are this way, and what will it mean about me or my masculinity if I have a child who identifies or who presents themselves this way. So I do think curiosity can at least be one first step in identifying it's less about them. The kids are all right, and it's more about, I feel a little unstable and confused by this, and I'm putting this on them.
I love that idea of curiosity, because I think the biggest thing I see that gets in the way of a relationship is parents' fears, because this is a time the world is changing rapidly, and they're very scared about what they're sending their children out into, and they want to provide as much support and stability as they can, and to not know seems like more instability and lack of support. So they need to know, and they need to get firm, And they forget that this is about your child. And I think just in general, that's what I see with adults is I'm going to make sure I give you all the things that I need, and to recognize this is not about your needs. This is about what does my child need?
And Mark, I think you mentioned too, a lot of times you're getting parents who are bringing kids to you, in some way of, it's scary to, we're professionals, but we're not a parent. We open the idea that I could be doing something wrong. And while that's never our intent and never anything that we would say, it brings up this idea of, I would love to be able to solve this as the parent. That's my role. That's what I should be doing. But in actuality, there has to be some openness to, you can't be everything to this person. And as kids age, it gets easier maybe sometimes, never completely easy, but easier. But when you're looking at, a young teenager or even someone just graduating high school, they still feel so fragile maybe in some contexts, or, maybe fragile isn't the right word, but they still feel so under your purview as a parent that you say, if I let someone in here, are they going to do as good of a job as I would do? Or would they do a better job? And that means something, So really, if a parent is bringing, a teen, and I also just think that there has to be some empathy for just how difficult that is in and of itself. And the child will probably not see that, but even just being aware of that dynamic, and for us being able to say to parents, we get that, we're not coming in to swoop in and change everything or to negate everything that you've done, but to say it does take a village. It does take multiple people from multiple backgrounds, just in the same way that we're saying we're not the experts on everything, but we can certainly be a sounding board for some of these things if you feel this might be out of my depth.
Yeah, I recently had a parent that brought in their teen, and they were basically saying they really just need somebody to listen to them, and just one more place where they can get things out and there's no complication of the parent-child relationship or things like that. And I was just so happy to hear that. I mean, like, kids are missing that so much. Just somebody to listen to me and try to figure me out so that I can figure me out.
And that's always interesting too. I was just having this thought today too, while kind of thinking about this podcast. I was like, the desire that will never be articulated from a lot of the younger, especially young men that I see in my practice, to have someone be curious about them and want to know things about them and want to uncover things. They'll never ask you to do that. They'll never ask you to do that. And in fact, they might push away from that and talk about everything except what they're feeling or what they're thinking or anything like that. But even just conversations that I've had that are mundane, like, what did you have for breakfast? And, how was vacation? These very surface level things, you can see that there is connection happening, even in that, and that they're hungry for that in a certain way of just saying like, yeah, I want to talk about something mundane and not have it become either an argument or an analysis or an interrogation in some ways.
Yeah, I want to be pursued. They really want to be pursued, even though they're presenting the complete opposite at the time. I don't know, maybe, I don't know. But what they really want is for you to keep asking.
Or my favorite, the complete silence or the shrug.
Well, so there's a lot of good topics here. Tim, I know you wrote a blog for us around, when to contact a therapist. Like, what are some of the red flags when you as a parent need some backup? And I'm hearing from the conversation, it's like, hopefully being able to put the ego aside, not taking it personally, not seeing it as a threat, but really trying to get your kid the help that they need. So I'm curious, Tim, for your answer first, and then Jack, you can follow up, is like when do you ask for help around these things?
Yeah, I think for me, writing that blog, the biggest thing that stood out was the level of social isolation, and that when that gets extreme, and I also work in addictions, and to me, that is just the biggest red flag. When you're completely isolating yourself, you're not only hurting yourself, you're removing any chance of ameliorating the problem by isolating. And so when you see that, and then also when things are abrupt, if you've always kind of been a quiet person and you always kind of enjoyed being in your room, you have to take that with a grain of salt. But when you see something shift, all of a sudden I'm not doing things with friends anymore. All of a sudden I'm not interested in things that used to interest me. It's time to take notice. And again, I think that's the biggest thing, is just take notice, to really be involved in your kids' lives and know what's happening. What is this? Did you break up with someone that I don't know about? Is this causing this? Or is this a much deeper issue? So getting in and listening and knowing what's happening with your kids is so important. Watching for abrupt changes, large changes. And then for me, just the biggest red flag is isolation. Which is hard, because that's also a normal part of teenage. But you want to, is it differentiation or is it isolation? And so some of that is getting education as an adult as well. As one of the parents is this my child separating from me, or is this my child separating from life?
I am curious too about this idea of isolating from me. And, you hear from the teacher in the classroom, they're a social butterfly, but at home, complete isolation. And, I'm curious, what I'm asking a question and I'm formulating the answer to, but like, what would you tell a parent that's kind of like, they won't engage with me, like they're isolating from me or from, us as parents? Like, how would you maybe, leading the witness, but normalize that in some ways?
Yeah, I think I would start with asking, who else are they isolating from? Are they isolating at school? Are they isolating from their friends? Are they isolating from their friends' parents? Maybe that's one really supportive factor that I have seen, is sometimes with other people's parents, it's amazing how different kids are. And then, we'll have kids come over to our house and it's like, oh, they're so lovely. And then you worry about your kid because that's not how my kid treats me. Well, yeah, because they're your kid. So asking questions again, being curious as to, where is this? Is this just me? And if so, is that okay? Asking, where else is this happening?
And, agreeing with everything that you're saying, Tim, too, I think one of the things that I see are kids rather being brought into therapy when it's so far, the pattern is so, far gone. It's so enmeshed at that point that, as therapists, it's like, oh, this is going to take some work, not only from just this teen to open up, but to also say what is happening at home in general that has led to this in some ways, in a way, again, that isn't blaming, but is just saying, if the isolation's been happening for years and now you're coming in with this versus it's been happening for 3 months, it's tricky. I don't think that there is maybe this is the perfect time to go to therapy, but I would almost say, like, parents, trust your gut. If you feel like it would be beneficial to talk to a therapist or go into family therapy or whatever it is, it doesn't have to be forever. It could be 5 sessions, it could be 10, it could be a couple of years, whatever. You're partially in control of that as well. But if there's an inkling that it could be beneficial, rather than doing it out of fear only, rather than purely doing it out of something, I'm putting this in quotes, bad or wrong is happening, that there's something like, oh, I think this could be helpful, restorative, or healing. That's always a good indicator.
That's one of my first lines of inquiry when I'm working with teens is, does this kid really need to be here? Does this kid really want to be here? Or is this parents' fears? And just kind of sorting all that out. And like you said, maybe it's a couple of sessions and making a different recommendation. Maybe we uncover deeper things and we decide, okay, we really need to do this. But then, I think erring on the side of caution and, well, let's just get somebody else's perspective. And maybe it's 1 or 2 sessions and let's talk.
Yeah, well, so I think you're both bringing up, like a family systems model, which I also subscribe to. I also came up in addiction. So the idea of the identified patient was really common in the addicted family, right? The idea that the addict is a problem and then everyone else is totally fine. And we don't know why this happened to our kid, So I wonder from each of you, what are some, blind spots that parents might have, or what are some dynamics that could be going on in the household that do impact teens? And I think this generation is or if it at least feels very different. So parents, you might not be aware of what, Jack and Tim are talking about, but the idea here is that hopefully this might illuminate some blind spots, because I do think effective treatment, especially if your kid does have significant issues, it's a whole family endeavor. You can't just ship them off and have them come back, cured, or have them come back changed.
Something that I see is indicative of teenagehood or teenagedom is the don't tell me what to do. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions. My parents are constantly telling me what to do. They're trying to control me, which means they obviously think I'm doing everything wrong. And that parents are completely on the other side of that, saying, I'm trying to help you. I'm trying to support you. I'm trying to teach you. This is my role, is it not? And to recognize that being on opposite sides of that coin is normal. And then seeing, is this being extended into an area that is too much? Am I trying too hard? And that's where opening up the dialogue is super important, which can be difficult with teens.
Yeah. It comes back to that communication part, right? Is communication is not always going to look the way that you think it should look or how you want it to look, especially in those instances. But, talking about these unspoken things that teens aren't going to ask for, that they benefit from, it's structure, it's boundaries, it's all of those things that I'm trying to help you, but it's the hardest thing that you can ask a parent to do, which is to let your kid stumble, let them fail, let them have a hard time with some things, obviously making sure that they're safe and making sure that there's nothing, irreparable that would happen. We got to put context on that. But the job, I remember an old supervisor of mine would always say, kind of the job of the parent is to let the child stamp their foot and say, I hate you, and, still say, I love you, rather than screaming back, I hate you too. That's one of the most difficult things to do is to come from this place of unconditional positive support and regard, and to let them not like you at times, and not feel like you have to be the cool parent or the permissive one, and a lot of that is why I then say, like, parents, you can go into therapy too. You can get support on this. You can vent about your kid. You have all this space to be able to get support for yourself as well. Just as I would say for teenagers, find a place where you can vent about your parents. Yeah, you're not always supposed to be best friends, and in fact, it's sometimes better if you aren't, and that you can identify, I'm an individual separate from this person, and that there are moments of joining and there are moments of conflict, and that's normal. The biggest thing I would say is the kids are watching you. If you are fighting, if you are, displaying, I'll use this kind of button term of toxic masculinity or bigotry or saying these things, they're watching, they're listening, they're either taking that in a way that says, well, I partially identify with this. Dad actually wouldn't like me if he knew that I shared some of these things, or, that's okay to say, that's an okay way to behave and an okay way to engage with the world, because this is a man that I look up to and someone that I like, and that supersedes gender identity or sexuality. I think that across the board, sons are looking at their dads as indicators of what it is to be a adult male.
Yeah, I think that's so important to be able to say to your kids, teenage years are really the first time that you can say, I disagree with you, and I hear what you're saying, and that's okay. And that's part of the process. This is when they were kids, we told them what to think and believe and do, and now it's time to listen to what they have to say and to be okay if that's different than what we tried to instill in them.
And it's difficult, right? Because there's a certain age where you realize, oh, I might have to let go a little bit of this control, when before it was necessary to make sure that they don't walk into traffic, and it's extremely difficult. And not to keep saying it's difficult, because there are so many things about parenting that are so lovely and so wonderful and all of these things as well. But I want to make sure that it's almost saying, like, you shouldn't expect it to be easy. If you are sitting there as the parent saying, other people are having a much easier job, or doing a much better job rather than I am, and all these things. Like that is part of the letting it go too, and just saying like, no, this is work, this is a relationship, this is all of those things as well. And it's a lot to be a role model and to know this person is looking to me for all of these things when maybe sometimes I don't always feel like I have it all together.
Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you wanted to open up, but you were afraid that it wouldn't be taken well? You ask yourself, what's the point? Nothing's going to change anyway. So you do what you always do. You push it down, numb out the pain with a drink, a night out, or pornography. I've been there myself, and I know that men lack the outlets for emotional expression, which is why I founded Men's Therapy Online, a healing hub for men's mental health. If you've been knocked on your ass or just crave meaningful connection, join Men's Therapy Online, a community of men who just get it. We offer individual therapy, men's groups, and powerful retreats, all led by licensed therapists. At Men's Therapy Online, we will help you to get back on your feet and take your life to the next level. Start your journey today at menstherapy.online.
What are some things that you two recommend parents learn, whether it be certain, relational skills or get educated about things? Like, what are some common gaps in knowledge that you feel like it's the parent's responsibility to learn as their kid does transition into this teenager phase, where you both indicated that it's very different from the young child phase? It's a completely different game. And I know for my parents, it also fluctuates, right? There's days where your teenager will act like they're 5 and they will need, to be held and to have a stuffed animal and to just like be nurtured. And there are times where they act like they're 35, and they want to just like live their own life and have nothing to do with you. So I'm curious, what can parents like study up on almost as like a, proactive measure if they're feeling inspired by this conversation?
I found it really interesting that you mentioned Eric Erickson, Jack, earlier, because that's actually where I went. Is he's the one who developed these psychosocial stages of development, and to really recognize here's what it is to be a person. And it was just one model of breaking it down into 8 stages and the challenges involved in each. But it can be really enlightening to see that, okay, here are things that I need to work on in these different stages. Here are what my kids are working on in these different stages, and to be aware of that. And I think that also helps to kind of take a step back and look at it from a systemic lens of this is a long process and this is one piece of what's happening right now. Because when you're in it, you're in it. And it feels like this is it. I have to do this right now, or my child is never going to thrive. And to step back and go, so like you said, some days are better than others, and to be able to look at it from a softer lens.
There's that parallel process, right, of the parent feeling like I have to do this right now, and then you've got a teen being like I have to figure out who I am right now and do all these things right now, and then you're not really helping each other out at all, because there can be no support if it's just this constant cycle of anxiety that needs to be solved right now. And the mind boggles at the amount of resources that are out there, and I think that that's a double-edged sword, which is like, well, what's going to help my child? And I think to that point, sometimes starting broad and reading like, you don't need to read, Eric Erickson's papers. I'm not going to make anyone sit down and read, these psych papers, but even just kind of, Googling, chat GPTing, this is my teenage son's age, what should I be expecting them to kind of be going through right now? And even just kind of having that idea, because to be honest, we were teenagers, but a lot of that we block out for our own safety and sanity. So it's kind of foolish to think that, well, we've been there, I know exactly what it's like. If you were to say that to a teenager, they would laugh in your face, because, I was that teenager. A lot of the time it's just being like, you don't get this. What are you talking about? But the goal is again, going back to this idea of there's so many things in the world that you just can't expect to be an expert on. You can't expect to be perfect expert on childhood development as a parent, and you're not expected to, but just to know the periphery, even for what it's worth, downloading some of these apps that they're using and just kind of seeing what it's like to be on them, or what it's like for, to kind of experience, oh, this is kind of what my kid is seeing. You're obviously going to get trapped if you look too long, because that's just what I hear from every parent, who just like, well, now I'm learning a bunch of cooking tips. But there's a lot of these things that you can at least just brush by and get a taste and a flavor of, this was not around when I was a teen and it's here now. And just having some knowledge about that. Again, resist the urge to be the cool parent. I kind of have to say, because it's never as functional as stepping back and saying, this, instead of feeling like a raw emotional nerve when it comes to parenting and your child, but to say, okay, I know that this pulls for something emotionally, but I've got at least this data that I can pull back if I need to and say, this might be one of those moments where, they're struggling to feel their identity and that's why they're, behaving in this way or acting in this erratic fashion. Maybe it can be that rather than I'm a bad parent or, they're doing something horrible that they're not telling me about, because it's easy then to catastrophize. But if you've got some of these things to point to and say, yeah, I read that this could be normal at this point, it at least can soothe you so that you're not also exacerbating the situation. And you can always go to a therapist too. That's a great resource too. Like I said, just having somewhere to go and talk these things out. Perfect.
Yeah, I love that awareness that the world that your teenager is growing up in is a very different world than the world you were a teenager in. And a sensitivity to that and a curiosity, again, of learning what is this like? What is this? But also not discounting that the world that you grew up in had its good qualities too, and its stability and its, there's a blend of understanding you're in a different place, and also saying, here's some of the good things about where I came from. Let's bring those two together.
And I think that that's a perfect way to kind of talk about that too, is you have knowledge as a parent, right? That you're not coming out of this completely unawares or completely not knowing what to do. Like, you have experience and years. It might not be recognized or lauded by your child, but to acknowledge that there are some times where you do need to make decisions and you do need to step in the driver's seat. And this is always kind of a place to look at and say, like, are you always stepping into the driver's seat? Is that something that you always feel like you have to do? Or, looking at patterns and again, trying to not have it feel like all completely emotional. But yeah, they're, parents can give themselves a lot more credit, because there is this idea of you're doing, simply by being there, you're doing so much more than you can possibly know, and you won't get thanked for it immediately, but there is a lot to be said for presence and curiosity and all these things that we talk about that your child might not even know that that's, doing something so beneficial.
Yeah, so let me ask about the role of technology, because I think that is perhaps one of the main differentiators, between teens and their parents. And you mentioned, Jack, about downloading the apps. I think that's a great idea. Like, just take a look at them and see, what's on there, what's being fed to your kid, good, bad, and ugly. So I'm curious with the role of technology in online spaces, whether it's, Discord, TikTok, a gaming server, what are... Actually, I was going to say pros and cons, but I actually want to say, like, what are some common misconceptions and what are some actual threats, right? Because I think it is, like, really misunderstood by parents. And sometimes they see threat when there's no threat. And sometimes they are not aware of threats when there are actual threats to their kid, One
thing that I've seen change is, as I mentioned before, the whole online gaming and be able to game with your friends. That's one of the dangers of video games, is they are so fun and so engaging. People can completely isolate and completely get obsessed with a video game and be by themselves all the time. That was my fear. And then I realized, actually, they're playing video games with their friends. They're downstairs. It's essentially like when I went and played basketball. It's a different world. So recognizing that, as we mentioned before, but also being aware that video games can be very much a substitute source of dopamine. They train you that you're going after something, you're going after a goal, and it really gives you that sense of, I'm doing something and this is important. And that is great for entertainment and fun and even some learning. And it can also reach the point where it is becoming obsessive and it is becoming where you go for your dopamine. So yeah, the knowledge to be aware of or be sensitive to what is the difference there.
And if we were to even put this in an addictions lens, right? Like, the idea of this is a coping strategy. Video games can be a coping strategy. is it the only coping strategy? Is that the one socializing place or the one place where they're de-stressing? That's something to keep an eye on, because they can be having a lot of screen time, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. If it's the only thing that's regulating them or the only time that you feel like they're kind of contained, then something is going on there that's, maybe worth investigating a little bit. The other thing about that too is I think that the chat systems, like that bullying is rampant on these, systems, and that if I leave my child unattended, that they're going to be, that something bad is going to happen. And it does, right? Like it does happen in those instances, and it's something to talk to your kids about and say, if something like that happens, like bring it up, talk about it. This is something that is worth talking about and not just sitting with. But a lot of the times I do hear it's more social activity, engagement. It is fun, and to kind of say, this is what it can be, but be wary if it's the thing that is really the only thing that's benefiting or helping your child feel, consistent.
Yeah, one of the things that I tell parents I work with, this maybe as a call out to you parents, right? It's like, it's on you to make real life more engaging than the screen. And I hear that a lot, right? Where it's like you have a parent that, doesn't like the screen, but then what are they doing in their spare time? They're telling their kid to do chores or telling them to do homework, or they're on screens themselves, frankly. So there is this idea that play is still very critical with your teenager. Like, do fun stuff together in the real world. If that's something you value, do it with your teen. Take them out fishing, take them out hunting, take them to go-kart, do mini golf, right? Like, do fun stuff with your teen. Like, let loose a little bit, be funny, tell some jokes, like get in touch with your teenager within yourself. And I think like your kid will realize that there's more to life than just a screen, but it is on the parent, because if the only alternative is just like doing physics homework, it's not that appealing.
Yeah. And even playing around with, is this going to be a fun time for you? Maybe not. But you know what? We'll have done it and we'll have figured that out. And I have a lot of, parents who said, we've tried drums, we've tried the trumpet, we've tried, football, we've tried these things, like every avenue thing, and kind of saying like, yeah, expose yourself to that if you can, and see what sticks, and maybe it doesn't. And that's okay too. There are a lot of options, even if it feels like, well, I can't constantly be entertaining them. Like, there's a lot of things that are accessible to you. It's really stepping out of the worry, to be able to access those things and to say, there can be some fluidity here.
Mm-hmm. And trying new things is just so important in identity formation. I mean, how else do you know what you like unless you go out and try? And I think modeling that to your kids. We're telling them, go do this, go do that, go do this, but we're going to work and coming home, cooking dinner and going to bed. I mean, demonstrating curiosity, demonstrating willingness to go out and try new things, I think is really important. Again, they're still kids. They haven't stopped learning from what you're doing as they ignore what you're saying.
And the misconception too that I hear a lot is, that they can access anything on the internet. And so you constantly need to be monitoring this and looking at these things. While, that's a very obvious, of course, there's so many things on the internet. There are going to be things maybe that you don't want your kid to see. Expect that they're going to come across some of these things and be able to say like, well, I've had conversations about, similarly to what we talked about on the gaming systems, like if something makes you feel uncomfortable or you have questions about something, like you can ask me, that is something. You're not going to get in trouble for saying I was looking at it or doing these things, because it just sets this precedent of being policed. I've heard from a lot of kids who their parent like keeps track of everything, of just like, I want to find the few things where my parents can't, that they have a desire for that or a desire for those things. And almost from the parent side, you can release some things. If it does feel important to you to have, supervision on some of these things, great. But what are some areas where that you could tolerate maybe having less of that control or less of that oversight? That's, the boundary, rather than saying, I have to just throw out my hands and let them do whatever they want. No, like there can still be those boundaries, right? That it will be good for them at the end of the day. But everything being policed and everything being seen, there is a reaction to that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really important to recognize that, yeah, having a teenager is the time where you want to keep them safe and you need to keep them safe. And it's also the time to be teaching them that you trust them to keep themselves safe, and balancing those two.
And they think of themselves as adults at 15, 16. That there is this idea that they are mature, that they are, all these things, and they very well can be. But, Mark, like you said, like sometimes they're going to want you to just hug them, or they're going to want to regress a little bit, or they're going to want to go back to that, space, and to leave space for both of those things to happen. That neither of those things is a sign that anything is off or wrong, that there needs to be some fluidity in their development as well. That all plays into that.
Well, so as we're moving towards the end of this roundtable, there's a lot of great stuff that's been brought up. I want to ask a final question for the two of you, which is, what in your work gives you hope for this upcoming generation? What is some of the gifts or their superpowers that they have that gives you hope?
I think going back to the clients that I was thinking about in the very beginning of this, who are, young cis men who are coming in and are curious about how to engage with the world, that is such a hopeful thing to hear, because that message might not necessarily be coming from somewhere. That's something inherent that they're, seeing around them and kind of just running with, rather than having a talking head say this to them, or maybe even a parent say this to them. Like, they've come to that conclusion on their own. And the more that I see that, the more that I feel like there is this functional flexibility, that a lot of the times is the biggest issue with Gen Z folks, is this rigidity, and feeling like this is how it has to be in order for things to be okay. That is clearly self-soothing to a certain extent of like, if I can just keep it this way, then things are okay. But that openness to saying, yeah, I want to know, I want to learn, I want to be curious about this, is it gives me hope. That's the word, right? Like it just does give me hope that there's not this huge shift to people being rough around the edges, or technology's ruining people's brains, or all these things. It's like, no, that's a very common human instinct to say, I do want to come together, and I do want to be knowledgeable about this, and I can still be perfectly fine in my masculinity and sit in that and not have to worry about that either. It's great to hear that coming from a lot of different places.
I think what I've seen specifically in my work with teens and parents trying to come together and trying to learn to communicate is that underneath there really is a respect and a love. And there's some teens that have been in hard places where we just cannot engage without blowing up, and recognizing that it's a communication issue. It's not about the lack of love. It's not about the lack of respect. It's about the way we come at each other, essentially. And that to see underneath that, kids are still able to relate to their parents on a deep level. Kids are still hungry for that. They want connection. And a lot of it is just going about how to do it is what's so difficult. And like I said, especially with technology and things growing the way they are, there's just so many different options now and so many other ways to do that. I'm gratified to also see that the core still remains of that need for connection and love, and that desire for connection and love.
Great. Well said. Well, I've enjoyed having the two of you on the show. I know you'll both be on. You're in the ecosystem. So, listeners, if you want more of Tim and Jack, you'll get more of them in the coming months. So this is the beginning of a conversation with them. But yeah, as we're wrapping up, where can they find you online if they want to hear more about you? Tim, you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, I'm at Men's Therapy Online. So you can reach me through the Men's Therapy website, or email is tim@menstherapy.online.
And I am on Instagram at Jack Knows Best. My website is jacklambertlmhc.org. And I will make sure that all this information is obviously connected to the podcast. And my blog post also has that information as well.
Great. Yeah, all that stuff will be in the show notes. So if y'all click on the description, you'll see all those links. And yes, there'll be a podcast, there'll be a blog from both of these guests on our website, menstherapy.online. So yeah, thank you all for tuning in. I hope there was some value for you. Again, my hope is that it sparks some conversations. If you're inspired, go talk to your teenager about some of the stuff that you listened to today. Just see if this is true for their experience too. If you've gotten some insight into what their world might be like, that curiosity is, often the first thing that opens up the door. So as you know, the Men's Therapy Podcast is part of Men's Therapy Online. You can find all of our stuff, including blogs, podcast episodes. We also offer therapy services, right? Individual, group, couples, retreats, whatever you want, we have it. Check us out at menstherapy.online. That's menstherapy.online. And thank you again for tuning in. And we will see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.